Let's get underway with our second block. We're privileged today to move into another area. It's kind of related, but also different from what you've just heard. We're calling it How Virginia Has Changed and How It Hasn't, the Changing Landscape of Virginia. It's my privilege to welcome Dr. Steve Farnsworth. He's a very respected lecturer on political matters and on political affairs in the entire Commonwealth and across the United States. He is a professor of political science and international affairs and director of the Center for Leadership and Media Studies at the University of Mary Washington. He's also the author or co-author of 5 books. He received a PhD and an MA in government from Georgetown University, a BA in history from University of Missouri, Kansas City. So did my wife. And a BA in government from Dartmouth College. And I was privileged this year to engage in a campaign debate with my competitor that he moderated, and it was a very good session. So please turn your attention and welcome to Dr. Farnsworth. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. When we set this program up today, what we decided to do for my segment is to talk more about sort of changing Virginia over time, and so to talk about the election in the context of other elections historically in Virginia. It gives us a sense of how Virginia is changing. I like to think about Virginia visually. Increasingly, I think one of the things, and this is one of the ways to reach students, is to look at these data points and try to make maps, try to make visual interpretations of what's going on in Virginia. And so I have some maps here about how Virginia looks and how Virginia should look, if we consider the fact that people vote and acres don't. Now, you don't need to take like pictures from your smartphone. The way that we're going to set this up with the public broadcasting station that's going to send you the link is they have the original slides, and so they'll be inserting the slides in the program. So you don't need to take notes, and you don't have to worry about that. So you'll have a much higher quality product when the folks at public television are through. Not to say that you're not great at selfies, but the technology does have its advantages. Now, there are 5 things that I want to bring up about what's different about this election and how things have changed. I'll go through the list. I'll show you some evidence of that. But as in the last session, we'll have a significant amount of time for back and forth. I've done these programs before, and I know a lot of you have a lot of interesting, thoughtful points to make about Virginia politics and how it's changing, and so we'll have the opportunity to compare notes. So among the 5 things, I think the first thing to appreciate about 2017 and how that's different is that women matter. You're looking at an election where a lot of, thanks so much, a lot of energy came in response to Donald Trump. As we talked about in the last session, there was a very powerful anti-Trump effect that shaped the conversation. And particularly when you think about who chose to run, you saw a much higher level of interest on the part of people willing to run on the Democratic side than you often saw in the House of Delegates. You have basically, in the old legislature, about a 2-to-1 advantage for Republicans, and we're looking at right about a 50-50 advantage, 51-49 probably, for the Republicans in this next election cycle, the new legislature that takes office in January. So there's been a huge change. And one of the key reasons for that change is the fact that a lot of people were mad about the election last November and decided to do something about it. And many of the candidates, particularly the candidates who won and run, were women who got motivated to participate in politics at a new level because of Donald Trump's election. Many of the female candidates who were elected on the Democratic side, they participated in the marches in January. They wore hats and got motivated, and they decided to do this because, remember, running for office is not a pleasant thing. It takes a lot of money, a lot of time, and you have to put up with a lot of grief because even in a friendly district, a lot of people aren't going to like you or what you have to say. You know, more power to it. One of the reasons why I'm a professor is because I would never want to do something like that. The second thing to appreciate about 2017 and how Virginia is changing is that diversity matters. You know, many of these women who ran and won also were African American or Latinas or Asian Americans. And particularly when you look at the contingent of victors on the Democratic side, that took seats from Republicans in Northern Virginia, you see an extraordinary level of diversity. And so politics increasingly is looking more like the electorate. And that's a really powerful message, I think. And that explains why the turnout was so engaged with respect to anti-Trump, but it was also engaged sort of bottom up in terms of these individual candidates who were knocking on doors and working through their communities, and they looked like the communities that they were seeking to represent. Increasingly, that diversity is really showing up in terms of the patterns of political outcomes in terms of elections. The third thing is the young people matter. Normally, when we think about elections in Virginia and we compare the presidential election to the gubernatorial election a year later, we see significant drop-off among younger people, which I'll define as under 30, no offense, but that's how we do it in political science, and then also among African Americans. These are people who are really motivated in great numbers turning out in presidential election years, but we see a significant drop-off a year later. So there is a pattern of decline that you normally see. You did not see it this time. The share of the electorate that was African American was comparable to a presidential election year. The share of the electorate that was under 30 was comparable to a presidential election year. So the patterns are, in many ways, all of these points are favorable to Democrats that we've mentioned so far. The fourth one is also favorable to Democrats, and that is suburban voters matter. You see a growing share of the electorate in Virginia being suburban voters. And so the speaking to suburban voters is the key thing, it seems to me, that the Republican voters have to do when they think about how to be more competitive going forward. If you think about the Bob McDonnell election, for example, in 2009, the message wasn't designed for rural Virginia. The McDonnell message was all about jobs, Bob's for jobs. That was the mantra of this campaign. It was about economic development. And that is a winning hand because a lot of people are not going to be persuaded on social agenda issues. They have their point of view, they may be pro-abortion, they may be anti-abortion, and that's not going to change. How are you going to talk to these voters in a way that you might get them to vote for you if they're not reflexively going to? It's going to have to be something else. And economic development is a good issue to use. And if you're in Northern Virginia, transportation is a good issue to use. And other parts of the state, maybe in Hampton Roads, transportation could be a powerful weapon there too. But for most parts of the state, the economic concerns are paramount, particularly those areas beyond the big cities and the suburbs where there is a lot of opportunity economically. And then the last thing, and this is a Donald Trump issue, and this is an issue of why people vote. I think when we look back at 2016 nationally, I think a lot of people were voting their fears. I think a lot of people looked at the world as they saw it in 2016 and were persuaded that there was a reason to be angry, that the future may not be as bright as the past. And if you look at various measures of economic opportunity or high levels of unemployment, or certainly if you're in areas of the country where industrial production has moved offshore or has become more mechanized, you can see why people would say the world doesn't look as good going forward as it looked in the past. Now, looking back and feeling good about the past may be a sort of a natural human instinct of nostalgia, but it doesn't necessarily square with evidence, right? In some cases it does, in some cases it doesn't. If you're thinking about issues of diversity and equality, the past is not a particularly appealing model to go to. If you're thinking about the issues of how the workplace is changing, if you have a high education and high level of mobility and training, then you might feel like the past might not be the best place either. The transparency of workplaces is creating its own level of anxieties, but there are opportunities that are far greater than they would have been perhaps for your parents or your grandparents' generation if you are more educated and more mobile. But if you do live in a Rust Belt community and you look at the factories that used to open and aren't open now, or that don't hire as many people as they used to, you can see why there's a significant level of anger at the present. And you can complain, of course, about certain factors, and other factors you can't. An awful lot of job loss in industrial America has to do with greater mechanization and automation. There's a lot of work that's being done by machines. But you can't be angry at a machine and get anywhere politically. Damn that electricity is not going to work. as a strategy. But you can talk about who might be taking the jobs. And so when you look at jobs that have moved to other places, you can see where that anchor comes from. I think that what we see in 2016 is another example of how people are voting their anger. When you look at 2017, it's anger about Trump above all. And so in the previous conversation, there was a lot of talk about how Virginia has become more blue than it used to be, and that's certainly the case. But when we talk about a range of, say, 1 to 9 point tilt Democratic, I'm probably going to be at the lower end of that range. I tend to think that this was a wave where Democratic candidates won largely because they were Democratic candidates. I don't think that, particularly in the Prince William races, I moderated several debates up there, and in the Fredericksburg area, and I will talk about the 28th district as part of this, you see a pattern, I think, of people who just basically said, I don't like Trump, where are the Democrats? And that's sort of the pattern that we saw here. Now, thinking about Virginia politics visually, and I have a few slides of evidence here, and then we'll open it up for conversation. The first thing to appreciate is the sort of what Virginia looks like. Now, if you're a Republican, you're going to like this map. It shows a lot of red. The darker the red, the better the Republicans did in that district. And you can see Southwest Virginia, just the darkest red here. You see, of course, the blue areas of the eastern part of the state. When you look at Hampton Roads, you look at the city of Richmond and Henrico, you look at Arlington, Alexandria. So now let's think about the fact that people vote, acres don't. What does Virginia really look like? It looks like this. Okay, this is your state on drugs. This is an adjustment that looks at Virginia in the context of how many votes are cast in each jurisdiction. And so you could see Fairfax, Arlington, Loudoun, Prince William, Richmond, Henrico, Virginia Beach, Newport News, and Norfolk. You could see how different Virginia looks if we think about it in the context of where the voters are. Now, you've seen maps like this for the Electoral College. And I'm working with Steve Hanna, who's a colleague of mine at Mary Washington. He works in the geography department. And this is one of the things that we've been focusing on lately. How can we think about politics visually? And how can we reach students who really are much more inclined to think visually than textually? I mean, I guess I'm old enough that I was really a text thinker. I was a writer. I was a journalist before I became an academic. And so I really think about things with words. And I think about things with data and numbers and that sort of thing. But what does it look like? And so, I showed this picture to my class the other day, and they said, oh, now I get it. It was like a light came on. And so if you're, like I said, if you're a Republican, you'll like the previous slide that really looks at the geographic boundaries. But when you look at the issues with respect to voting and who actually votes, you see what's going on. Now, this slide needs one quick correction. We had Chesterfield slightly red. The recounting that's been going on suggests that it may end up slightly blue. Okay, so that pattern is still going on. But now, let's talk about it in the context of over time. What has the situation in Virginia looked like in 2017 when you compare it to 2013? And this is what it looks like. Okay, this is much, much bluer. Okay? Now, and so what we have here is an increase in support for Democratic candidates. This isn't who won the district. Is it more Democratic than it was 4 years ago? That's blue. Is it more Republican, or less Democratic rather, because there was a third-party candidate in the election 4 years ago? Is it less Democratic than it was 4 years ago? And I know that one of you asked a question in the first session about how your rural area is becoming more Republican, and this is what we see, particularly here in Southwest Virginia, that these are areas that are becoming more Republican in their loyalties, but when you think about how many votes they cast statewide, it's not that many. And so you see here how powerful the dynamic is for Northern Virginia, Chesterfield and Richmond, and Virginia Beach. We describe this as a pair of blue scissors, although I imagine your teenage students might see another image. The point here is that even the areas that Republicans win, they're not winning them by as much. Okay, it's a pair of scissors, all right? It's a pair of scissors. You're going to have this same problem if you show this slide in your class. But the reality here is that even where Republicans are winning, they're not winning by as much. And that's why they're facing so much trouble in statewide elections when you look at 2017. But I don't know that this is necessarily a long-term trend. I don't know that political parties have permanent majorities or permanent minorities. It seems to me that when the Trump wave comes in, the Trump wave comes out, Republicans would do better in another election cycle. In fact, if Hillary Clinton were president right now, I tend to think that, the massive gains that the Democrats received in the House of Delegates would not likely have taken place. I tend to think that what you saw was really more a Trump effect than anything else. It may have been that Northam would still be elected governor, but I cannot imagine that we would see a legislature that goes from 66 Republican seats to 51 if Hillary Clinton were president. Then there would be a lot of focus on Hillary Clinton, and that would have kept the Republicans more united, perhaps, than they were in this election cycle where Corey Stewart was almost the Republican nominee. Now, just to give you a sense of how things have changed, I've got on the right here the numbers, the percentages for McAuliffe in various categories, and then I have Northam and Gillespie. I want to draw your attention to women. The number on the left here is the percentage of the electorate from the exit poll that was women. It was just over half. But look, McAuliffe won 51% of women. Northam won 61%. Non-married women, already a very Democratic group, more so. Northam did better with whites, and he did about as well with African Americans, and he did much better with independents. And so when you look at how the Democratic message worked in 2013 versus how it worked in 2017, you can see significant gains. And this is also the case, again, talking about where the votes are being cast in Virginia. The D.C. suburbs now represent 28% of the state electorate, and the gain for McAuliffe, 48% in 2013, 54% for Northam overall, but in the D.C. suburbs, it goes from 62 to 69%. And so not only are there more votes being cast in Northern Virginia, there are more blue votes being cast as a percentage of the total. So the numbers are really, really moving in a direction that is problematic for a Republican message, particularly one that tries to concentrate on white voters in a state that is increasingly diverse. When you look at the areas that are more Republican than Democratic in Virginia, you see, like in the mountain regions of Virginia, the 81 corridor, for lack of a better way to describe it, McAuliffe did as poorly as Northam. So it isn't as if the Republicans have stopped reaching rural Virginia. They still do. The problem is the percentage of votes cast in rural Virginia falls with each election cycle. And speaking to the age issue in terms of the young people, one of the points that I gave you starting out, among the under 30 voters, which are about 15% of the electorate, McAuliffe won 45% of them. Northam won 69%. And this is a big, big problem for Republicans going forward. The Republicans continue to do their best with voters 45 and over. The numbers were pretty close between where the Democrats finished in 2013 and where they finished in 2017. But the real disparity is found among those counties that are suburban, and the voters that are younger, and the voters, of course, who are more diverse. One of the areas, and this is one of the continuing Trump effects, is with respect to lower income voters. Once upon a time, the Democrats really had a great deal of strength among lower income voters. You don't see that anymore. There's been a significant decline in terms of Democratic vote share for under $50,000 a year family income, and that's a quarter of the electorate. And it is traditionally a significant advantage for the Democrats when you talk about lower voters. But this is one of the areas where Trump, I think, has been relatively successful, convincing lower income voters that his message, that his approach to politics is the one they should endorse. By 2 to 1, when people were talking about Trump in this election, they were voting against him. When you talk about what mattered to people in this election, issues didn't matter much. I think one of the things to appreciate is that every candidate for office at every level, even candidates for governor, had to deal with the fact that Donald Trump dominated the news cycle every day of their campaign. If you wanted to be in the news as a candidate for office in Virginia, you had to answer the question, what do you think about what Trump did today? That was the only real choice you had. Now, a real conversation about issues in Virginia would say, okay, how are we going to fund causes that are important to us? How are we going to spend money more effectively or more money on education? How are we going to spend more money on health care or spend it more effectively? How are we going to figure out how to make economic activity more vibrant in our communities? How are we going to get from here to there and not pay a huge time tax like we do here in Northern Virginia? And so all of these kinds of things are part of a normal conversation in a Virginia election. The whole reason we don't have our elections during presidential election years is so we can have our own Virginia conversation. Well, we couldn't, and we didn't. And so I remember talking to people working on the Jill Vogel campaign, and she said, we are doubly hurt. First of all, everybody thinks about the governor's race, not the lieutenant governor's race. And that's true. And she said, but people are not even thinking about the governor's race. They're thinking about Trump. And so they said, how in the world do we get in the news this campaign for lieutenant governor? And of course, they didn't. And that was the problem for them. When you think about what issues mattered, though, we did in the exit poll ask, you saw a significant focus on health care. And, it seems to me that the Affordable Care Act has never been as popular as it is. I mean, for all the effort that Barack Obama made to try to promote the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare and all the rest, the Medicaid expansion, all of it, the real salesman to successfully promote the case for the Affordable Care Act appears to be Donald Trump. It's more popular now than it ever was. And so for people who think health care is the big issue, they went for Northam 3-1. And as politics gets more personal in terms of how you feel about issues and how you feel about people, there's less room to compromise. And so you end up with a situation where candidates who had a D after their name were going to have a good year no matter what. There are fewer areas of greater range of capacity than challengers to an incumbent elected official. Sometimes people say, hey, it's my year, this is a friendly district, I'm going to run, and there are people who are maybe already in elected office, local office perhaps, running for the House of Delegates. But then there are other people who just say, I'm mad, I'm going to run. I don't have political experience, but I got anger, and that's my case. And so you had that too. And so you had candidates who had issues that probably wouldn't have been as palatable to the electorate who were running on the Democratic side. If you think about somebody who proudly proclaims himself as a democratic socialist in a Virginia election, that's probably not a smart call. Even in Prince William. But it didn't matter because there was a D after the name, and that was good enough for that particular race. There's there are ideas that are out there that are probably not all that palatable. There was one Democratic candidate in Northern Virginia who thought that people in the country not legally, the undocumented or illegal aliens, whatever term you want to use, these people should be given driver's licenses. Okay, that's probably not a winning argument in the minds of a lot of voters. But it didn't matter. There was a D after the name in a year in which that seemed to be what mattered. But look at how Donald Trump has changed things in terms of health care. When you think about how people voted for health care as a key issue back in 2013, McAuliffe only got 45% of them. Northam gets 77%. So when you think about these kinds of issues, you really are seeing a significant dynamic here. And again, when you look at the regions, you really see powerful dynamics. Fairfax, it's the biggest county in the state. It goes from 58% Democratic to 68% Democratic. Even places like Arlington, which are overwhelmingly Democratic to start with, are more Democratic than they used to be, going from 72 to 80. Loudoun, 50 to 59, and Prince William, 52 to 61. And then, of course, you could see, I've got some other counties around the state, and I'll just show you a couple more slides, and then we'll open it up for questions. When you think about the outer ring suburban counties, where you have traditionally Republican advantages, once you get beyond Prince William and so on, you see Democratic gains in a lot of places. In particular, I want to draw your attention to Stafford, which is the next county down Interstate 95 from Prince William, which is usually one of the biggest Republican counties in the state. And it went from 40% Democratic to 47% Democratic in the governor's race. The Republicans still win Stafford, but if even the big counties are close to 50-50. The Republicans don't win statewide. And that's the challenge for the Republicans. The city of Fredericksburg, city of Winchester, you see Democratic gains, but you also see them in places like Spotsylvania and Culpeper, where Republicans have long had the upper hand. This isn't just a D.C. phenomenon. Henrico and Chesterfield, even Hanover, while it's still largely Republican, it's still slightly less Republican than it was. And what this means for the House of Delegates, and this is the last slide I want to show you, and then we'll open it up for questions that you have. Right now, we're looking at a situation where there are, as we discussed in the previous session, 3 recounts likely to take place. The Republicans are ahead in all 3 places. If they stay ahead, it's 51-49 majority for the Republicans. One district in Newport News, right now, the margin is 10 votes. And so we'll see how that one turns out. If the Democrats prevail there, then it's 50-50. But the key thing that marks 2017 as different from the elections that came before was the number of cases where a Democrat and a Republican were willing to run for office in the same district. Of 100 House of Delegate seats 2 years ago, only 29 had a Democrat versus a Republican. And only 3 had a partisan flip, and they were all north of Quantico. This year, instead of 29, there are 59 of 100 seats where you had a Democrat versus a Republican. And you can't beat somebody with nobody. And so that's a big, big difference. And that's, I think, perhaps the most powerful Trump effect of all. The willingness of Democrats to say, you know what, I'm not just going to be angry. I'm going to go out and run for office. And that was part of the strategy that created the opportunities for the Democrats in 2017. Let me just speak a moment to the 28th district, which is my home district in Fredericksburg. This is the one that has a whole series of problems with respect to the way that it was conducted. And so we don't know what's going to happen right now. But as you heard in the previous session, there are significant legal challenges going on in this district. This is Speaker Howell's old district. He's retiring, and he is looking at a Republican-favored district. It's drawn just to elect a Republican, but in a wave election, it's less Republican than maybe it needed to be. What basically happens is in the Fredericksburg area, you had the city, which is the most Democratic jurisdiction between Richmond City and Prince William. The city of Fredericksburg is the most Democratic jurisdiction in the whole area. Split it in half. Half of it is in one district, half of it is in the 28th. It's the 88th is the other district. And they split precincts and divided the precincts. And that created lots of complications for the election authorities. So there are a series of issues that have been raised by the Democrats who are behind that are going to have to be adjudicated. The biggest one is the claim that people were given the wrong ballot. There were right now the Democrats claim there were 668 incorrect ballots given out in the city of Fredericksburg. 668 incorrect ballots. Because you walk in, they look you up, they see your ID, they give you a ballot. And depending on what part of the precinct you're in, you would get a District 28 ballot or you get a District 88 ballot. Okay? Now, the margin in this district is 85 votes right now. Okay? Now, we have not heard from the election authority in terms of a response. Okay? This is something that came up last night. The Democrats filed a complaint about the improper ballots. And and your average voter is not going to necessarily know which ballot they should have gotten. I walked into my voting booth and I looked at my ballot and I had the correct one. But I'm in one of these contested wards. Part of my ward is one district, part of my ward is the other. But, I talked to one of my friends a few days after the election, and they said, we live in the same house and we got 2 different ballots. And I said, well, that's taking gerrymander a little too far. If you're going to draw the line right down the bedroom wall. But the only reason they found out is that it was a fluke. The husband comes out after voting and says, I didn't know we were in the 88th district. And the wife said, we're not in the 88th district. And so how many people are out there that didn't even think to have this conversation with their spouse, or they lived alone, or they were the only one who voted, or anything else. We have no idea. And there's no real easy way to fix this. If this really happened in great numbers, I can only offer you an anecdote of my friends where there's a couple, one got one ballot, one got the other in the same house. But if there is really something along this magnitude, there's no real way to fix it. You get a ballot, you put it in the bin, and then it's the same bin, it's the same precinct. And so there isn't a way to say, okay, you got a wrong ballot in any kind of realistic way. So this could be a very big mess. There are other problems too, but that's the one to really watch. Another problem that happened was it looks like the part of the district is in Stafford County. Basically, if you know the area at all, it's basically east of 95, the part of Stafford County that's east of 95, and the part of the city of Fredericksburg that's between Mary Washington and the river. Okay, so the downtown area of Fredericksburg. And so those two areas are in the 28th district. But here's what happened in the 88th. Apparently, they didn't go to the post office to pick up all the ballots, absentee ballots, that came in on Tuesday afternoon. You see, under the law, the election authority has to have the ballots by 7 p.m., okay, on election night. And so if you don't go back to pick up the ballots, you get them on Wednesday morning, you say, oh, they're late. There are apparently 55 ballots in this status. Now, the Democrats originally said they were veterans, because obviously they want the ballots to be counted, but it's anybody whose ballot just ended up coming in the mail that day. And now it's an opportunity, of course, for people to blame the Postal Service. Because apparently when you cast an absentee ballot in Stafford, it has to come all the way to Richmond to get sorted to send it back to Stafford. Now, however long that takes, there were ballots there in the post office box on Tuesday night that didn't get collected. And so there's actually a legal challenge going on in terms of, you remember Bill Clinton and the legal challenge of what the definition of is? Well, now we have the Postal Service version of this. The Postal Service, in trying to defend itself, is saying, well, actually that mailbox, the post office box, is property of the county. So it wasn't the county's possession before 7 o'clock. So what we're talking about here is Christmas for lawyers. And so I have no idea how this story ends. But if the claims about the ballots that were handed out in error is sufficiently widespread that we're looking at a significant problem, you may very well have to have another election, which means there would be 50 seats in the legislature by one party and 49 by the other. And it'll probably be the 10-vote margin vote district in Newport News that basically elects the next speaker, whichever way that turns out. Because the issue in Fredericksburg, it's sort of hard to imagine this getting resolved quickly. If there is any merit to the Democratic claims, and people in Fredericksburg have anecdotal stories to tell, then it goes to the lawyers. But this isn't, by the way, just a potential violation of state law. You have a legal right to the ballot for your district, as it turns out. It's also potentially a federal violation, because for those of you who know Fredericksburg City, and I'm guessing almost none of you do, we're talking about an African-American majority precinct where this problem occurred. And, by the way, the Democratic candidate was an African-American candidate. So you could count on a significant advantage for a Democratic candidate if the ballots were properly delivered. So there's all kinds of interesting things to think about. So just watch this space, the 28th district. I had coffee with Bill Howe yesterday, and he said he retired at the right time. The challenge for the next speaker is going to be a great one. When you have 66 Republicans, you can always let a few of them vote however they want for local matters. But when you have 51, everybody has to be on board for everything. And as the Republicans have discovered in Washington, that's sometimes a great challenge. 52 senators on the Republican side does not mean passage of a Republican bill. And we've seen that repeatedly this last year. And so one of the themes that I often talk about in my research is how Washington is starting Richmond is starting to look a lot more like Washington in terms of the defeat of moderate politicians and more polarized caucuses, the greater tendency towards gridlock, fights over elections. We have it all. It isn't just Washington anymore. And so with that, let me open it up for comments and questions for all of you. And again, all these slides are going to be in the program that the public television station is providing, so you don't have to worry about taking notes. And there's, of course, no test today. Please.
So going back to the precinct, or Fredericksburg, should it have been then that each location, there should have only been one ticket there, and somehow tickets got, like they should have gone to maybe a different school? Or how does that work? Like each precinct only gets one ticket, correct?
No, you have 2 stacks of documents. So you walk in well, I live in Ward 2 in the city. So you walk into the community center for Ward 2, and they look you up and they say, okay, you get this ballot.
That's been that way?
Yes, since the 2011 situation. I mean, one of the, we're talking in the last session about how we could fix some of the problems of the way the lines are drawn. Well, here's my suggestion. No split precincts. I mean, we can deal with the electorate that's a little bigger, a little smaller from one district to the next. But, really, I mean, we have to recognize that this is a challenge that makes it very difficult for the election officials. There are people out there who might claim that this was some kind of malicious thing, the mistakes that might have been made. I don't really think so. I think they were asked to do a very tough job. And so, we could make it easier for the election officials if we said, look, if you're in Ward 2, you're in this district, and everybody in Ward 2 is in this district, and that's the end of it. But this was deliberately done to divide the Democratic votes into 2 Republican areas, because if in the 88th district, Spotsylvania is very Republican, half of the city of Fredericksburg there, Republican wins. In the city of Fredericksburg, again, very Democratic. If half of it goes to the Stafford district, Republicans win in Stafford. Again, you split up those Democratic votes, and you've made it very complicated. And that's the big problem. So we're really asking people to do something that may not be easily managed. I mean, it's a challenge, I think, to be an election authority official in the best of circumstances. And this is apparently too complicated. And this has been going on for years. We've looked back and we've seen other election cycles where votes were improperly cast, but it was never close enough that anyone really made an issue of it before. So we looked at the returns for the 2015 and the 2013 elections, also using the same lines, and we saw that there were mistakes apparently made in those others as well. So it's not clear how this story ends. I don't know. Maybe the election board can explain a little more closely what happened, but when you read the statute, it does look like there's a problem here. Yes?
Can you try to explain to us, if it's not too complicated, why they decided to have split precincts? I mean, I live in Hanover now.
It's simple. They want to win.
I go to a specific place.
Right.
Here, come out. Like why? I don't get that.
Well, the reason they do it this way is because it maximizes the chances for success. I mean, ultimately, if you're a Republican and you're drawing lines, you want to elect Republicans, you draw lines to elect Republicans. Same thing with the Democrats. And so by splitting the city up the way they did, they maximize the chances that the 2 districts that include part of the city will still both elect Republicans, even though the city itself is more Democratic than Republican. That was the strategy. It's about winning. It's not about making it simple for the election authority.
I understand that, but what I don't understand is if you are in a district based on where you live, and your precinct is determined by that, then why do I even have the opportunity to get that wrong ballot?
Well,
that's the piece I just can't wrap my mind around.
but you see, the part of
We're
the
inviting you there, which I'll notice to.
Right.
You want to fix this election,
Yeah.
but that's like so unfair.
well, it's a problem because ultimately you only have a set number of voting jurisdictions. And so in Fredericksburg we have 4 city wards. And so there are 4 places that you go to vote, okay? And so because the precincts are split, you walk into the same place. If you're in the part of that precinct that is in the 88th district, you walk into the same place if you're the part of the precinct that is the 28th district. It's a very terrible system. But actually, but I could tell you a worse story. You've got a long day, so let me give you a joke. My first vote in Fredericksburg was in 1996, when I first moved to Mary Washington and lived in Fredericksburg. And I went to the wrong place to vote. I went to a place called Walker Grant School. Okay? Well, the problem in Fredericksburg is that there are two schools named Walker Grant. Locals know them as the old Walker Grant and the new Walker Grant. And I didn't know there were two because I was new. And I was there 30 minutes at the wrong Walker Grant before somebody had the bright idea, do you know there are two Walker Grants? And I said, first of all, how come this wasn't the first question you asked me? You know? I mean, they're looking at my ID, they're calling election headquarters, and it's like, what is going on here? And so it's like, well, sort of the scariest word for any northern transplant to the South, well, you're not from around here. And I said, no, I didn't know there were two Walker Grants. So anyway, Fredericksburg has a lot of famous people, in its history. We could have named the schools for 4 different people, with the middle schools and high schools. But anyway, so I go there, and then I eventually get to the right Walker Grant, and I get to cast my ballot, and so then I'm okay. But these kinds of things about elections are really, really tough to execute and to manage, and so I'm not, I absolutely sort of categorically reject the idea that there was any malice here. I don't think the district was close enough that people thought it would need to be stolen, and I also don't think that the system was anything other than too complicated. And so that's sort of where I come down on the 28th. But again, we haven't heard from the election authority yet. Maybe they did it right, and it's just not clear to the Democratic Party that it was done properly. Yes?
So why don't they just have multiple, why do they only have 4 locations?
It's cheap.
To vote? So really it's the city could spend more money and have more locations to better represent itself?
Yeah, if you had more people, and you had more machines, and you had a greater willingness to do this. But one of the big problems is we don't spend money on election infrastructure. And this is a larger sort of challenge, I think, for just about every state and community in the country. You don't spend a lot. I mean, we have better technology to order a burger and fries than we do to elect a member of the House of Delegates. I mean, we have high failure rates with some pieces of equipment. Not so much in Virginia. We have a Scantron system. You fill in a hole. That actually has relatively low failure rates compared to what other places have. So, Virginia is not particularly an offender in this category. But it is the case that this is a very underinvested area of infrastructure. People like to be able to say, here's a bridge that I got you. People don't really have a ribbon cutting for a new voting machine. And so it's not necessarily a high priority issue to anybody. And it's only when something goes wrong that people say, oh, wait a minute, we need to do this differently. I mean, a former Virginia senator who participated in a previous redistricting when the Democrats were in the majority described the process this way. They had index cards of counties with data on them. Just a single 3x5 index card, and they would pass them back and forth like playing cards. Do you want this county? Do I want this county? That's how it was done like 20 years ago. The technology now is so different in terms of what they can say and do. In the Fredericksburg area, they actually drew lines to make sure that somebody wasn't, who they thought was going to run for office, wasn't in the district he wanted to run in. Okay? They got it wrong, though. His father wasn't in the district. Father and the son had the same name, like the damn Walker Grant story I told you about a moment ago. So they didn't draw the lines quite well enough to exclude the candidate. So the candidate was actually in the district that he wanted to run in, and he won. But his father couldn't vote for him, and he felt bad about that. But there it is. So these are the kinds of things that happen. It's really an infrastructure problem, but it's never going to be fixed because people will say, look, do we want to spend more money on schools or roads or health care for seniors, whatever it might be, because something has to give. Virginia, and most every state in the country, is subject to a little bit of fiscal responsibility compared to the federal government, which is subject to basically none. They have to balance the budget. And so in the federal government, they could just say, you know what, we want to do this, but we don't want to ask people for money, so we'll do it, and we'll just put it on this sort of global credit card that's out there. And we deficit spend to fight wars. We deficit spend to pay one program after another. We can't do that in Virginia. I mean, you can tinker with the money a little bit. You could push some bills into the next fiscal year or something, but it's nickels and dimes compared to, ultimately at the bottom of the bottom of the ledger, the budget has to balance. And that means that things don't get funded that might be very valuable because something else is seen as even more valuable. And I think election infrastructure is a great example of something that is underfunded. I sometimes think maybe we should just let McDonald's run our elections because they seem to have better technology for burgers and fries than we do for voters. Of course, we might end up with Mayor McCheese, but that's life. Yeah.
Are there other districts? I can't remember what you said.
Yeah. Yeah, this is done. I can't give you an actual number of how many there are, but split precincts are routine. And it really can disadvantage districts. If you think about Prince William County, for example, Prince William County is big enough to have its own congressional district, okay? But that's not how they drew the lines. Republicans drew the lines to make sure that a Republican would be elected at least in 2 of the 3 districts that include Prince William County. So if you're looking at Prince William County, which is a suburban county outside D.C., part of it is in basically a Fairfax district, Jerry Conley's district. Part of it is in the Barbara Comstock district, which basically stretches from, say, Dulles Airport to the West Virginia line, Leesburg, Winchester, Front Royal, that area. Okay? And then there's a 3rd district, which stretches from Prince William to Newport News, the 1st district, which is Rob Whitman's district. Okay? So basically, you have not a keg tapped at both ends, but a keg tapped in 3 different places. And so Prince William County doesn't have its full representation, in my view, in Congress, because you're not the priority in Prince William County of the 1st district. You're not the priority in Prince William County of the Fairfax dominant district, and you're not the priority in Prince William County of the northwestern Virginia Shenandoah Valley district. So Prince William doesn't really have its own person. And why was that done? That was done so that Republicans could win those 2 seats. And if you had a Prince William district that was a Prince William district almost exclusively, Democrats probably would have won it. And that would have been more favorable to the Democrats. The Republicans drawing the lines, it doesn't sound good to them. Yes?
So wasn't it done when Prince William population wasn't exploding like it is right now? When they did all those divisional lines? Because now the population is one of the fastest growing counties in Northern Virginia. I mean, you still have Fairfax and Loudoun. But like I said earlier, Prince William County is so diverse in their politics. I mean, it's back and forth all the time.
Right.
So do you think it will ever change?
Well, I think there's a great temptation to make a Prince William County dominant congressional district after the 2020 census. I think it's going to be hard to avoid it because of the political pressure that's going to be out there. Because remember, this next legislature, the governor that was elected this month is going to be signing or vetoing a redistricting bill. And Ralph Northam will get a lot of advice from newly elected Democrats in the Prince William County delegation to make sure that Prince William County is well taken care of in terms of congressional redistricting. Because here's what you do. If you're a Democratic governor and you don't like the Republican-drawn lines, assuming Republicans are in the majority at the time that we draw the lines in 2021, assuming it's a Republican majority, you're looking at an environment where you'd veto the bill. And so you don't have to, remember, when the last redistricting occurred, the lines for Congress were drawn by Republicans. Majorities, a big Republican majority in the House of Delegates. The environment had a Republican governor, and so it was much easier for Republicans to get what they wanted. I think that with a Democratic governor, regardless of the composition of the majority of the House of Delegates and the Senate when 2021 rolls around, and there is another Senate election before that, of course, and another House election before that. And I tend to think that Republicans will win some of the stuff back that they lost this time. Even if you end up with Republican majorities in both chambers, there's still that Democratic governor to say, wait a minute, no, Prince William County is going to be taken care of. And, that's smart politics, right? Because if Prince William County is taken care of, and it's a Democrat who does it, where might those voters turn in the next election cycle? So, you can see why Northam, if he has any sense on this question, would take better care of Prince William. And the population growth creates that environment. I mean, the average House of Delegate districts has about 20,000 votes cast in it, in terms of the governor's vote for governor. In some of the Prince William County districts, it was 38,000. So it's dramatically bigger when you consider these were all the same size back in 2010. And so that means that there's going to be more representation coming out of Prince William County. Loudoun too, but Prince William was the I think the great example of how a county can get treated poorly by line drawing. I don't think the Republicans have a monopoly on wisdom. I don't think the Democrats have a monopoly on wisdom. I think that the smart way to figure out what's best for the state is to have a conversation. But increasingly in politics, we're seeing no conversation. You try to pass a bill without the other side. You try to pass a bill without even having hearings and markups. Some of the bills, like the one that Delegate Anderson mentioned, it was probably one of those 7 a.m. committee meetings that there wasn't even a recorded vote. 7:30. And so however much there may be an effort among some people to try to put forward a plan, the reality is that there are other people who will make sure that it doesn't get very far. And that's, I think, a disincentive. And so one of the things I think that is the lesson for how we can have better politics in Virginia is to really try to figure out ways to increase the level of civility and reward those politicians who are willing to at least talk to the other side, to try to figure out a way that we can come up with something that we can all more or less live with. So I want to say thanks as well to Delegate Anderson for organizing this and for his service in public life. It's not easy to run for office, particularly this year, but it is a great testament to the kind of public commitment that we've seen across his career. So thank you very much.